The policy criminalised a lot more. The standard licence conditions, point 14, states, "No naked flame, pyrotechnics, fireworks, knives, sharp objects or similar should be used as part of the performance." I asked the buskers to estimate what proportion of West Piazza shows contain dangerous props, and, unsurprisingly, they said it was about 90%. In other words, only 10% of the shows on the West Piazza, London's most iconic busking pitch, could even busk within the terms of the licence. Everyone else would get a licence, break the rules by using dangerous props, immediately lose their licence, and end up where they started. What would be the point of signing up to that? The policy also makes getting a licence an impossibility for performers visiting from other countries. In its licensing application process and procedures, they say that a performer needs a declaration of right to work in the UK. But according to the person I spoke to at Viva La Visa, who are entertainingly named specialists covering visas in the entertainment industry, buskers don't need the right to work. There's no artist or work visa that covers street performance, and buskers are allowed to get remuneration under the tourist visa as long as it's not part of a contract. This is no small thing. It's not just tourists that come from all over the world to visit the West Piazza, it's also buskers. Many incredible internationally touring street shows put Covent Garden's cobblestones on their world tours, and it's brilliant. Not just because locals get to see a constant change in the roster of performers there, but because it does wonders for local businesses. The volunteer directors of the Covent Garden Street Performers Association were therefore given a choice. They could get their members to sign up to a licence that makes most of their shows illegal, or continue, business as usual, by telling their members to ignore the licence. They chose the latter. Is that how the council report presented the facts? Of course not. Its authors instead suggested that the SBA told their members not to get licences because they wanted to have the flexibility to move around the city and not have specific rules or conditions that, if breached, could lead to the loss of their licence and, therefore, their livelihood or a criminal conviction. Well, that makes it sound like the buskers wanted to be lawless, roaming vagabonds. Sure, the Covent Garden SPA didn't think that buskers should be stripped of their livelihoods and treated like criminals, but the basic fact is that the licence excluded them. Later on, the report suggests 5 more reasons why a busker might not decide to sign up for the licence, 3 of which were: they may have criminal records, they wish to avoid scrutiny from state agencies such as HMRC, or they do not agree that the licensing regime should apply to them. It may be useful for the council to portray the buskers as tax-dodging criminals who believe they're above the law, but there are lots of other reasons why someone might not sign up. For example, the SPA already self-manages in a way that virtually eliminates noise complaints and have done for decades. They use so-called dangerous props in their shows, so they couldn't get a license. They couldn't provide a right-to-work declaration because it doesn't exist. They can't afford the public liability insurance mandated by the council. They are homeless and can't provide the home address required on a license application. They don't speak English as a first language and were unable to navigate the council's English-only website. There simply isn't enough space for everyone to perform legally, so what's the point of even trying? They don't believe that a relatively new council should be able to criminalise a cultural tradition dating back at least 3 centuries in London, or they are offended at how the council has treated them by, for example, suggesting that they are tax-dodging criminals who think they're above the law. Ignoring all that, and instead questioning the morals of unlicensed buskers, is an awful, insulting misrepresentation that shouldn't have made it into an official council document. In fact, an increasing number of performers that I've talked to now believe, not without evidence, that because of misrepresentations just like this, the report's authors are out to get the street performers associations in London. But more on that later. This one's a bit weird, but the council seems to have a problem with determining the biggest or highest in a numeric set. I have 2 examples of this, one of which is comical, the other is unethical. The report showed this graph of how many complaints they received per month. They said it shows the highest number of complaints were received in August 2021 and January 2022. That might be a funny error, but it appears that the council also don't know how to focus on its complaint hotspots. The report repeatedly claims that Leicester Square and Covent Garden are its 2 worst areas and therefore need the most airtime. Unfortunately, the council still hasn't released the redacted complaints data for the period since the policy went into place, so we can't double-check their maths. But we can get a feel for how bad things were in Covent Garden and Leicester Square by looking at the complaints data from 2017 to 2019. That dataset has 3,990 complaints in total. Of those, the 2 pedestrianised plazas and tourist hotspots, Leicester Square and Covent Garden, received 215 and 24 complaints respectively. At the same time, Oxford Street appeared in the complaints 1,136 times. Anyone who's been on Oxford Street knows that it's a busy shopping road with thousands of people walking on it, and that it's not pedestrianised, meaning traffic fatalities are a distinct possibility there. There are also complaint hotspots on Oxford Street, like a spot in front of Selfridges that came up 230 times, more than the entirety of Leicester Square. Oxford Street isn't mentioned in the 2023 report, nor is Villiers Street, which between 2017 and 2019 got 269 complaints. Nor, in fact, were any of these locations mentioned. However, there were 3 locations that the report focused on again and again: Leicester Square, Trafalgar Square, and Covent Garden. Were the complaints about these locations between 2021 and 2023 far higher than the others on this list? If so, I can think of only 3 options why. One is that the regime successfully managed to reduce complaints everywhere else. That would be an incredible achievement. However, if they had done that, surely they wouldn't be calling their own regime a failure. It would have been a stunning success, and the council would be congratulating themselves. Another option is that the council took these 3 popular, beloved, pedestrianised tourism hotspots in which busking has taken place for centuries and absolutely ruins them, so much so that they take up all the airtime in a 114-page document. There is a third option, that the council has singled out these 3 areas for attention because they all share something in common. They're all plazas, but I don't see how that would be an issue. They're all pedestrianised, but you'd imagine that that would work in their favour. The only other similarity that all 3 share is that they are performed on by buskers enrolled in street performers associations. Surely the report's authors aren't just singling out SPA pitches, right? Before you answer that question, consider this. The 2023 report has this to say about self-regulation in Covent Garden. The Covent Garden SPA suggested self-regulation or a scheme similar to the one used in the past. Self-regulation has been considered previously, but issues with obstruction and noise persisted. To see what they meant by previously, I looked at the council's busking policy report draft in 2020, published in December of that year. This is the final report calling for a new busking licence in Westminster, and it's the one that influenced the councillors to vote. In it, it says, having an SPA has provided the council and businesses in the area a location-based code of conduct designed specifically for the area. Complaints, however, continue to arise even here. That complaints continued to arise was a surprise to everyone at the time. The buskers in Covent Garden were adamant that there were no issues with the complaints on their pitches. Who was correct? Let's find out. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association manages 2 pitches. One of them is the iconic St. Paul's pitch, otherwise known as the West Piazza. That's the famous one. The other is Magic Corner, right at the end of James Street. The former is exclusively used by circle shows, the latter exclusively by, you guessed it, magicians. Both are active for about 10 hours a day and both are fully amplified. Here's how the council describes their organisation in their 2023 report. The Covent Garden Street Performers Association has been operating since the 1980s and has implemented a performer-run and self-regulated system with its own rules, governing body and disciplinary scheme, dealing with any problematic performers and ensuring insurance coverage and acceptable noise levels. They utilise a yellow and red card approach for addressing misconduct, including suspensions for repeated bad behaviour. Sounds great, but does their system work? Maybe not. Between 2017 and 2019, there were 180 complaints about busking noise on James Street. However, 3 of them weren't about buskers at all, 24 were up the other end of James Street, 1 was all the way over on Oxford Street, 42 of them were about musicians, not magicians. 70 of the complaints, therefore, were definitely not about SPA pitches. Magicians, on the other hand, were only mentioned 8 times. However, there were 7 complaints that used some form of the word shouting, so they probably were about the magicians as well, who tend to talk more than play music. Let's assume all 15 of those complaints were about CGSPA members. Of the 85 complaints that we can identify, 15 were probably about CGSPA buskers and 70 weren't. That means roughly 18% of complaints were covered by the Covent Garden Street Performers Association. There are still 96 complaints remaining. 25 of them mention amplified music. I reckon that means that they were more likely to be about musicians, but as magicians do sometimes perform with backing tracks, we'll ignore that. Multiplying that 96 by the 1570 ratio above, which is our best guess for how many of those indeterminate complaints were actually about magicians, you get another 17 complaints, bringing the total to 32. As for the West Piazza, there were 24 complaints listed as being in Covent Garden between 2017 and 2019. Well, 2 definitely weren't on the West Piazza. 2 were about buskers up the other end of James Street next to Covent Garden Tube Station. 1 of them was actually a complaint about a council official, and 7 were about musicians. That's 12 that definitely weren't the responsibility of the SPA. There was only 1 complaint that was definitely about a busker performing on the St. Paul's pitch. That's another name for the West Piazza. Funnily enough, that's the same number of complaints against the council officer. Anyway, 1 definitely about SPA buskers, 12 definitely not about SPA buskers. That's a rate of 8%. Doing the same maths as before, the West Piazza may have gotten 2 complaints in total. On James Street, 32 complaints. On the West Piazza, 2 complaints. That's a grand total of 34 complaints about SPA-run pitches over a period of 24 months. That's 17 complaints a year. Put another way, for every complaint that the Covent Garden Street Performers Association received in that period, they'd performed, always amplified, for 472 hours. It seems then that amplification is not the problem. The Covent Garden SPA's code of conduct and system for disciplining its members is enough. Perhaps that's unsurprising, given that their methodology has been practiced and refined over the decades, and that it has 100% buy-in from its members. Considering this success, it's no wonder that the SPA had an agreement with the council and the market's private land managers since 2007. Of course they do. In return, approximately 45 million people visit Covent Garden each year, and the street performers there are loudly promoted as the best reason to visit in every tourism guide or online review website like TripAdvisor or Google Maps. What proportion of those 45 million people come to watch the buskers? 1 million? 2? How many tens of millions of pounds in tourism spend do those buskers bring in? Or, put another way, the Borough of Westminster got almost 2,000 complaints per year over this period. Covent Garden SPA pitches received just 17. Surely, this would convince the council to leave Covent Garden as is. Apparently not. Instead of congratulating them for a phenomenal job reducing complaints, that 2020 report was worded to make the SPA sound ineffective. Even worse, the buskers were completely blindsided. In all previous discussions, it was clear that Covent Garden would be left out of the licensing regime. Here's what the SPA thought about it, according to the authors of the Council's 2023 report. In Covent Garden, they believe there are limited noise issues associated with buskers and street performers. Initially, Covent Garden was not included in the busking and street entertainment licensing regime, but was added late in the process with no clear justification or reasoning. That's not a belief, that's a fact. There was no justification or reasoning in that 2020 report for why suddenly Covent Garden had been added to the license. If that decision was the result of any debate, that debate was behind closed doors and never explained. Try to put yourself for a second in the position of a Covent Garden Street Performers Association manager. 40 years of history, a robust system of self-regulation, a clean record, a good relationship with local businesses and the landlord and the council, and then, with no explanation, the council criminalises the vast majority of your shows. Is it any wonder that the Street Performers Association recommended to their members that they shouldn't sign up for a license? Unfortunately, making that recommendation put the SPA in a tricky position. The 3 key characteristics of what's called an organised crime group is that they have a hierarchy, a profit motive, and commit a series of crimes over an extended period of time. The SPA is run by a few volunteers, the shows the buskers put on make money, and every one of them is a criminal act. In other words, Westminster City Council has turned the CGSPA into the busker mafia. I made that joke in a group chat with some SPA members. They didn't find it funny. The council has already used the term mafia in meetings to describe us, one said. Let's not do that work for them. So, that's the context. Let's look at the period of 2021 to 23. Why was Covent Garden the second most talked about area in the latest report? Is it because the council wants to attack the SPA, or is it because of complaints? The report claims that 305 complaints are situated within Covent Garden. Wow. The Covent Garden buskers put in another Freedom of Information request asking for the latest data, and for the first time, without explanation, the data the council produced was stripped of any identifying features. Why the change in policy? Unclear. But let's just take 140 complaints a year as the truth. According to previous data, only 8% of Covent Garden complaints are about the West Piazza. Assuming the same holds true today, then the West Piazza received 11 complaints per year. During the year, the buskers put on 4,866 shows on the West Piazza. So even if we are to believe that Covent Garden is suddenly 12 times as bad as it used to be, still, for every complaint received about the West Piazza, the buskers there put on 442 shows. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but some of the buskers are beginning to believe that as they are objectively doing a good job, and have done for decades, the report's authors have focused so much on Covent Garden pitches and been so misleading because they're trying to punish the SPA for ignoring the license. And it's worth repeating, that's a license that only 10% of their members could even get because it bans everyone else's shows.